Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. They gave me this bracelet to wear like you have. Or it's a server, I'm not sure. It's on my wrist, but anyway, I'm so honored to be with you. Thank you. Here's what I wanted to speak to you about today. And it's the theme of these summits, the American dream. You should clap, because the American dream is not something we talk about in campaigns alone. The American dream is our identity as a nation and as a people. There's a fundamental misunderstanding about what the American dream is sometimes. Sometimes people think the American dream is about how much money you make, or about how many things you own on the day you die, or about becoming famous, or owning a big business. This can be part of your American dream, but that's not the American dream at its core. The American dream at its core is about achieving happiness. And by the way, it's not just an American dream, it actually is a dream that people have all over the world and have had it throughout history. The reason why it's called the American dream is because it's happened so often to so many people here and has happened so rarely everywhere else. This is our identity. Every country in the world has rich people. Every country in the world has big companies and big corporations. Every country in the world has powerful families. But in America, we have millions of people who will never be rich and will never be famous, but who achieve happiness and a better life. And that's what makes us different. That's what separates us from the rest of the world. And so it should trouble us when we hear from everyday people that they no longer think this is possible. It reminds you that what's at stake in these elections, in our activism, what's at stake here for America is not just what party wins or what candidate is elected. What's at stake for our country is what kind of country are we going to be? So why do so many people feel like the American dream is slipping away? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. But we're not just living through an economic downturn. We are living through a massive economic transformation. I explain this to people all the time because if you don't understand that it's so difficult to solve the challenges that we face. First of all, we have an economy that's dramatically different from the one I grew up in. It's very different from the one we had 5 or 10 years ago. We have an economy, for example, where one of the largest retailers in the world is called Amazon. They don't own stores. One of the largest transportation companies is Uber. They don't own cars. And we don't just have a different economy, it is changing faster than ever. Think about it this way. It took 75 years for the telephone to reach 100 million users. It took Candy Crush, that game, 10 months to reach 100 million users. So we don't just have a different economy, we have an economy that is changing faster than ever before. But the policies that we follow in this country are outdated. And they're particularly troublesome when you follow the path of big government and more regulations and more taxation, because that has never worked. It is a disaster in the 21st century. It's a disaster. For starters, we have to compete globally now. There are dozens of other countries that learned from our example. And so now they have limited government, they have lower taxes, they have less regulations. And so every day we see American jobs and companies go abroad. So we're no longer as globally competitive. And so the first thing that we must do is become globally competitive again. That's why we talk about tax reform. That's why we talk about regulatory reform. That's why we talk about energy policy. That's why we talk about balancing the budget, because all of these things, the way they make us uncompetitive. For starters, do you realize that just last week the federal government instituted $200 million of new regulations in 1 week? You know what led the way? A regulation that regulated the energy efficiency of ceiling fans, which we all know is a real crisis in America. You can joke now, I had to get some water. I get fired up, I get water. Look, ceiling fans, $200 million worth of regulations on our economy. And so when people come to us and say about these things that we stand for, limited government, less taxes, less regulations, balancing our budget, fully utilizing the energy resources that God has blessed this country with, we're not talking about these things from an ideological perspective alone. We need these things in order to be globally competitive. It's why we need to repeal and replace Obamacare. We have a health care law in America. We have a health care law in America that raises the costs on people, diminishes the quality of health care, and encourages businesses not to hire anyone. I guess other than that, it's a pretty good idea, right? It's hurting our competitiveness. We need to repeal Obamacare and replace it. And replace it with what, people say? I'll tell you with what. Replace it by putting people in charge of their own health insurance. By allowing you to buy any insurance you want from any company in America that will sell it to you. If we just do these things, there's no economy in the world that can compete with us. We're the most innovative people on the planet. We're the nation that comes up with all the great ideas. We're the most productive workers in the world. No nation can compete with America, and if we do the things I just outlined to you, the things we stand for, the thing this movement is about, no economy will create better jobs in the 21st century than ours. But we can't stop there, because here's the second problem. All those better paying jobs, they all require more skills than they ever did. And unfortunately, today we are stuck with an outdated monopoly higher education system that is locking out millions of Americans from the opportunity at a better job. Why did we stop teaching people in this country to be welders and plumbers and electricians and car and airplane mechanics and air conditioning repairmen? These are good paying jobs. I promise you this, a welder makes a lot more money than a Greek philosopher. And we don't teach people, we need vocational education in America and give our people the skills they need for the best paying jobs. And by the way, we can have vocational education and it should be driven at the local and state level. And the federal government can help on the edges, but we don't need a common core curriculum to push that through. I'm for curriculum reform at the local and state level. You know why? Because if you give the federal government the power to set curriculum, they will force the states to do it the way they want you to do it, or you won't get money. And you know what that means for parents? If you don't like what's being taught in school, you have to get on an airplane and fly to the Department of Education to lobby them instead of your school board member. Here's a better idea. Get rid of the Department of Education and let's put power back in the hands of state and local communities. Here's the second thing. What if you're a single mother and you make $12 an hour and you're a receptionist at a law firm? You know the only way you're ever going to get a raise is if you go back to school and become a paralegal or a dental hygienist or a registered nurse or a software designer. But you can't. You can't go back to school. Because to go back to school means leaving your job, finding out someone to take care of your kids, while you sit in a classroom for 2 to 4 years, and it's too expensive. And you know whose fault that is? Whose fault that is we have a monopoly in higher education. We have traditionally accredited universities that basically say only we can provide degrees, and you must change your life to fit in with us. We're not going to change to fit in with you. We need to change that. We need to allow people to get credit for what they already know. If you served in the military, and we thank you for your service, here's a good rule of thumb. Here's a good rule of thumb. If you were qualified to transport dangerous explosives on dirt roads in Afghanistan, you are qualified to transport eggs in the interstate highway system of the United States. Give people credit for what they already know. Allow people to get credit for what they already know. And then what you're missing, let them learn it on their own, online, in free courses, in flexible courses that allow you to go to school online and on weekends, so people can acquire the degree or the certificate they need for a better paying job. And instead of making $12 an hour, they make $60,000 a year. That will change their lives. That will change our country. Now, I'm not saying we don't need traditional four-year degrees. Of course we do. We need traditional schools. Otherwise, how are we going to have college football? Although I think the welders would be pretty good if they had a team. But here's what I am saying. We can't keep graduating people from college with degrees that do not lead to jobs, but a mountain of student loans. I know about that. I owed over $100,000 myself in student loans for law school. I paid them off with the proceeds of my book, An American Son, now available on paperback if you're interested. You have thousands of young Americans. According to the Wall Street Journal this morning, 7 million Americans who have defaulted on student loans. People deserve to know. I believe that before you take out a loan, you deserve to know how much people make when they graduate from that school with that loan, with that degree. And then you can decide whether it's smart to borrow $50,000 to be a Roman philosopher. Because here's the hard truth. Here's the hard truth. The market for Roman philosophers has tightened significantly over the last 2,000 years. And our students deserve to know that. The third thing we have to do is keep our people safe. In fact, it is the only and most important obligation of the federal government. The federal government is involved in all kinds of things it wants to be involved in. This is the one thing it must be involved in. And we live in a world where today there are 5 major threats, any one of which should keep you up at night. I don't use this word lightly, but a lunatic in North Korea possesses dozens of nuclear weapons and a long-range missile which could hit the west coast of the United States. The Chinese hack into our government computers, one in particular. Listen, we joke, but this is a serious matter. They hack into our computers. That's why this thing that Hillary Clinton did is so bad. And it's impacting her campaign in ways people haven't anticipated. For example, last week she unveiled her college affordability plan. You know what it basically involves? You know it. Raise taxes on a bunch of people, pour a bunch of money into the same outdated programs. You know why it took her so long to release it? Because it had been wiped clean from her server. And so the Chinese hack into our computers, they steal our government secrets, they gather personal information on Americans, they steal secrets from our companies, they're modernizing their military, and they're taking over the South China Sea, the most important shipping lane in the world. And in Europe, a gangster in Moscow named Vladimir Putin is trying not just to divide Europe, but destroy NATO. And he knows that if he ever tests NATO and NATO doesn't respond, that's the end of NATO. In the Middle East, radical jihadists have now spread across dozens of countries in 3 to 4 continents. It's not just Iraq and Syria. ISIS is now in Libya, from where they conduct attacks in the Sinai and will soon springboard across the Mediterranean into Europe, from where they recruit Americans on social media to conduct attacks here in the homeland. Radical jihadists have spread now into Afghanistan, where they're in a battle to take over what the Taliban once was there. It's a very dangerous development. And then last but not least, our president has signed a deal with Iran that guarantees that a radical Shia cleric will possess a nuclear weapon and a long-range rocket capable of reaching the United States. These are dangerous developments. These are not political disagreements. These are dangerous developments. And yet this is the road we're headed on. And that's why the first thing we must do under the next presidency is we must rebuild our military to ensure it remains the single most powerful military force in the world. And we must have a foreign policy of moral clarity. And what does that mean? Here's what it means in one way. It means your allies believe you're their ally. It means if you are America's friend, we stand with you. And if you are our adversary, we stand against you. Now that's common sense, and you ask yourself, well, of course. That's not what we have today. We have a foreign policy today where the Ayatollah in Iran receives more respect than the Prime Minister of Israel. Israel, the only pro-American, free enterprise democracy in the Middle East. If I am blessed with the opportunity to be President of the United States, there will be no doubt in the minds of anyone on this planet that this nation will do whatever it takes to ensure that Israel survives and prospers as a Jewish state. So these are our challenges, and they're real. And I understand the people's frustration. Look, 3 times in the last 4 elections, the American people voted for change. We know how 2008 turned out, so in 2010 they voted for change. And then again in 2014, and nothing changes. And so people are rightfully frustrated. No, let's go further. People are rightfully angry and upset. And it's good to let that anger motivate us. But we can't let that anger define us. We are not an angry nation. We are a hopeful nation. And we have every reason to be, and I'll tell you why. Ask yourself this question. We have problems. We know the problems we face. What country would you trade places with? What country would you rather be? There is no nation on earth I would trade places with. This is still a great country. The issue is it needs to be even greater. We're not fulfilling our potential, and our potential is extraordinary. And by the way, we've always faced challenges. In every era in our history, we faced challenges. We faced challenges in our founding. We faced challenges during the Civil War. We faced challenges through a Great Depression and 2 world wars. We faced challenges through the Civil Rights era. We faced challenges during the Vietnam era. My goodness, we survived disco music in the 1970s. We have always faced challenges. Two people stood up. They didn't like the Bee Gees. We've always faced challenges. Ours is not a story of a nation that never faced challenges. Ours is the story of a nation and of a people that have always faced challenge and have always done what it takes to overcome them. We can do this again. Yes, we face great challenges, but we face even greater opportunity. You see, we live in the dawn of a new era, a new economy that's going to be about innovation and competition, and no one innovates or competes better than we do. By the way, this nation's been at this very same position before. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change America, it changed the world. And it was disruptive. It took people out of farms and moved them into factories. It took industries that had existed for hundreds of years and wiped them out and replaced them with new ones. You think the horse-drawn carriage people were happy about the invention of the car? But we look back at the Industrial Revolution as a time of extraordinary progress because that generation of Americans chose to embrace the future, not to run from it. Now it's our turn. What we are called to do now is to embrace the future with all of its opportunities and with its challenges. And as I sat here today and I spoke to you, as you heard previously from my friend Ted Cruz, as you heard from other people before, they all outlined the challenges. There is not a single challenge before this country that we cannot solve. We are one election away from solving these challenges. There is not a single challenge we face that we cannot solve. Now we just have to go out and do it. But to do so requires us to turn the page on yesterday. To leave behind the ideas and the candidates trapped in the past, an era that's come and gone. Especially in the other party. By the way, a lot of people are complaining about, oh, there's so many people running for the Republican nomination. It's true, 1 out of 5 Republicans are running for president. But we have 16, 17 high-quality people. They can't even come up with one. We need to turn the page on yesterday. We're proud of our history. We should be. But we've always been a nation that's been about the future. We've always been the nation that asks, what's next? Well, in about 6 months, across this land, depending on where you live, the American people will begin the process of answering that question. And the good news is that the beginning of this election cycle will signal the beginning of the end of 8 years of terrible leadership by Barack Obama. But getting rid of Barack Obama alone won't be enough. We still have to answer the question of what comes next. And what comes next for our country can be the greatest era in our history if we're willing to do what it takes. If we're willing to become globally competitive, if we're willing to revolutionize what it means to be in higher education, if we're willing to remain the strongest nation on earth. If we're willing to do these things, I'll tell you right now, the 21st century won't just be as good as the 20th century, it will be better. Your children and your grandchildren will be the freest and most prosperous Americans that have ever lived. And every single one of us is called to that task. And so I close with a personal story, because I believe all of us are called to this task. I want to share with you why I feel I am called to the task of serving this country in whatever capacity I can. You see, America doesn't owe me a thing. America owes me nothing. I have a debt to America I will never repay. When my father was 9 years old, he lived in Havana, Cuba. His mother died. And so he had to stop going to school and start working to help support their family. 9 years old. He never went back to school. He would work for the next 70 years of his life. Like all young people, he had big dreams when he was young. There were things he wanted to do, but they became impossible. And so the new purpose of his life became to ensure that we would have the chance to do all the things he never could. Here in this country, my father was primarily a bartender. He worked as a bartender, banquet bartender at hotels. And he worked on nights and on weekends and on holidays and on days I'm sure he didn't feel like working. He worked. He was proud of the work he had, but he wanted so much more for us. He worked so that all the doors that had closed for him would open for me and for my siblings. He stood behind a portable bar in the back of a banquet hall all of those years, so one day I could be anything I wanted. And the journey from behind that bar to the life I live today, for me, that's the essence of the American dream. And that's not just my story. That's not just my story, that's your story. That's your story. That's our story. Every single one of us in this country, every single one of us is a generation or two removed from someone who made your future the purpose of their lives. Every single one of us is a generation removed from someone who made great sacrifices so that you could do all the things they never could. That's the American dream. And I'm telling you, despite our challenges, believe this: if we do what needs to be done, that dream won't just survive. It'll reach more people, it'll change more lives than ever before, and we will leave for our children what our parents left for us, the single greatest nation that man has ever known. Thank you for having me. God bless you. Thank you.
This is how we roll.